You are listening to programming from the East-West Center in Washington, D.C.
Let me get us started. And for those in the back, happy to invite you to come on in or to close the doors. But let's get started because I know we have people online.
Now I'm not doing it. I mean, I
Hey, Stanley.
Through the COVID days.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us today. But I'm conscious that we have folks in the room, but we also have a lot of folks on our YouTube channel online, and I don't want to delay any further. But we have with us an absolutely tremendous lineup of speakers and a new book by our colleague Aynne Kokas, a professor at University of Virginia, and it's called Trafficking Data: How China is Winning the Battle for Digital Sovereignty. And obviously much of this stuff is in the news, you read all kinds of things, but now we have a world-renowned expert who has written a book on it and talk us through, and she's joined, you have all the details of their bios in your program, so I don't want to belabor, but she's joined by two discussants, also of great eminence, Dr. Ryo Sahashi, who's Associate Professor of International Politics at the Institute for Advanced Studies on Asia at the University of Tokyo, and is currently in Washington at the Wilson Center. And Sahashi Sensei and I go back a long time, so welcome here, great to see you. And we also have the founding and managing director of Longview Global, Dewardrick McNeil. And Dewardrick used to work at the Pentagon and throughout the US government, and is a well-acknowledged expert on China. We were just having a terrific conversation. And one other thing binds two of these speakers, and they were both graduates of the East-West Center's Asia Pacific Leadership Program in 2002-2003 cohort. And this is very important to us because the East-West Center, as you know, is not a think tank per se, but really an organization devoted to collaborative research, study, and exchange. And so having these professionals go through our program, continue their remarkable work, both in the academic, government, scholarly space, is just a real testament to the kind of cohorts we try to develop through real people at the East-West Center. So thank you so much for that. I want to maximize the time, and I know that Aynne is going to speak for about 25 minutes using a PowerPoint, and then we'll invite first Ryo and then Dewardrick to make about 10 minutes each of comments. Then open it up to the floor, and if there are any questions from our guests on the YouTube live stream, those will be communicated to me and then thereby to the panel. So thank you for joining us. Welcome, and over to you, Aynne.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much, Dr. Limay, for this wonderful introduction. And I am so excited and happy and honored to be here at the East-West Center. It really, being an Asia Pacific Leadership Program Fellow was really transformative for my life and my career. And in addition to DL, who taught me, who's knows more about China than I will ever know, and who taught me so much during our time at the East-West Center and beyond. We're also joined by another member of our cohort, Champagne Watson, who is also here and is from the State Department, who I've also learned a ton from about all these issues and about China and East Asia. So I'm really grateful to be here with all of you and as part of this, as a proud alumna of the East-West Center. And I'm excited to talk to you about my book, Trafficking Data. Now, the book is actually emerged from a very personal experience of mine. I was a Fulbright scholar in Shanghai in 2008 and 2009, diligently working on my dissertation, and that was the basis of my first book, Hollywood Made in China. And my internet kept cutting out. It was incredibly frustrating. As any student knows, you're just trying to complete your work, and you have this issue. So I had the opportunity to actually go across the street and work in the offices of a foreign-run VPN company called VP Ninja. So it just happened that these were my neighbors, and I went across the street, and they provided tech support, and I was able to access both the domestic and wider internet as a result of that support on a regular basis. Now, when I was working on the first book, I was really struggling with this issue of why Netflix was having difficulty entering the Chinese market. And Disney at that point had been very active in China. There were a lot of other studios that were really expanding into the Chinese market, but we were really seeing challenges with Netflix. And I was talking with my colleagues at the VPN company, and they were like, yeah, it's very obvious. It's not about the content that Netflix is producing. It's about the data that they're gathering. And that shifted the trajectory of my work in a profound way, and actually was the very kind of inception, or the seed of this book. So in Trafficking Data, I argue that US regulatory fragmentation, Silicon Valley's data lust, and Wall Street's addiction to growth have fueled the expansion of China's digital realm. Now, in many ways, this operates in a similar fashion as we see in the entertainment industry, where US firms are very eager to access the Chinese market, and as a result are willing to make trade-offs in their engagements and interactions with China. We also see in a US context that because of the relatively fragmented or limited regulatory environment as compared to China, even firms in the United States that are operating in the United States are willing to shift their content and their operations. So in the context of trafficking data, what I do is look at how in the US, the relatively free and open environment for data gathering in the entertainment context, as well as in a wide range of other contexts, ranging from health data to appliances, has led to a really significant expansion of China's ability to, and the Chinese government's ability to gather data in the US that is grounded in the open regulatory landscape that we see in the United States. So in some ways it's building on the regulatory framework that we have here rather than trying to diminish it, or the lack of regulatory framework. So the core concept of the book is this idea of data trafficking. So data trafficking is an extractive process by which our user data is gathered from a wide range of different platforms that we use on a regular basis. So everything from gaming platforms to social media to IoT devices to biodata, and then this is used by corporations to develop new products, and more importantly, in the context of China, is something that the Chinese government can pressure firms to share with them through a wide range of different mechanisms, ranging from national security data audits to pressure to share data with the Chinese military. Now this occurs through a range of different mechanisms. There are unethical corporate data extraction practices, so kind of misleading terms of service. There's data leakage, so maybe someone who shares data that maybe they're not supposed to share. But there are also very legal processes, like the outsourcing of user data to third-party businesses in the context of advertising or data brokers. So one thing that I learned in the course of researching this book that was really fascinating was the fact that that corporations can actually take our user data and use it as a financial asset that they can leverage to get physical currency, to get money and capital. So your personal information that you might be sharing on Facebook or on TikTok or through your vacuum cleaner is something that can be monetized by the corporation that gathers it. And then there is this issue of compliance, or compliance to local laws. Now this is something that's really interesting because most platforms that you might use for anything that you're using in your daily life will say that they will require compliance with local laws in order for you to be able to sign those terms of service. But those local laws, that idea of local law can mean a wide range of different things. So it can mean just in the event that you have committed a crime, or it can mean for the purposes of taxation, or in the context of China, it can mean pressure to share that user data for military purposes. But this idea of agreement with local law is something that I think is a very broad part of many terms of service that we see in the United States and other countries, that there's a deliberate vagueness on, that creates this space for data trafficking. But when we're thinking about data trafficking, at the core is this idea of data. So what is our data? Now we have this idea of data as a form of oil. So there are a lot of metaphors that we might be using for data. So this idea that it's a resource, something that can be extracted or mined. or maybe infrastructure for underlying systems. So our user data is at the core of developing new algorithms for products and services. So I don't know if any of you have used a social media platform and you realize that as you use it more, it knows you a little bit better each time. And so you start to maybe get recommendations on Instagram. You're like, this is great, this pan, I never knew I needed it, or this amazing hair product. Or so this is also a form of infrastructure where that algorithm is becoming smarter and more capable of knowing you and knowing about you in order to deliver products and services, but also in order to track your behavior, your decision making, your social networks, etc. And we can also think of this as an asset. So when that algorithm knows you better, then it's also able to drive sales. It's also to improve advertising capabilities. It's also something that becomes a better financial asset for leveraging in a banking context. But the key point of this, and this is one of the reasons why I use the word trafficking, is that a lot of interactions on consumer platforms really draw from our personal data and our personal life experience and our personal lived experiences. So things that we do in our homes with our families. So everything from, and I use cases in the book, including everything from baby monitors to refrigerators to blood tests and DNA testing. So when we think about the word trafficking, this is another way that we can think about this very personal, very intimate element of data gathering and the transfer of that data across borders. But when we think about trafficking, it's also important to think about this element of addiction. So how many of you have used a platform or have a tool or device in your home that when you use it, you kind of know deep down inside that maybe it's gathering more information about you, or maybe there's a slightly exploitative environment that you're a part of, but you just really like it, or it's really handy. This comes down to this idea of trafficking, this idea of the drug traffic, something that's sustained by these addictive behaviors, by the choices that consumers are willing to make to sustain these systems that might undermine or challenge national sovereignty, but that really are grounded in products that are highly addictive and highly appealing. And we can see this in our interactions with our family or friends, when people are like on their social platforms or on their gaming devices and just kind of totally sucked in. There's also this idea of human trafficking, this use of the word. And when we think about the kind of intimate personal data that we're sharing, this takes on this very human dimension, this kind of exploitative personal dimension. One of the cases I use in the book, which was kind of funny, one of my aunties was reading the book and she was like, I skimmed most of it, but you had this part about sex and data, and that was really interesting. So there are actually also, this is now you know about my aunties, but there are connected sex devices, so connected vibrators, connected sex toys that gather user data about people as they're involved in intimate acts that can also be shared transnationally. And this is the type of environment where most people are probably not like really rigorously reading the terms of service about what's happening with their data that's being gathered in those contexts. So there's this really intimate aspect of it. The other part that I think a lot of users don't think about, though, has become much more apparent in the context of the Twitter scandal recently, is that users are also engaged in a labor bargain with different platforms. So Twitter, and this is it's helpful to think about it because it's been in the news a lot these days. So Twitter was built on the content that is provided by its users, and so that's a type of labor bargain that Twitter is engaging in with, and users are engaging in with Twitter. But it's a sort of exploitative bargain in the sense that users aren't really getting paid for it, except for in like maybe likes and social standing. And so this kind of exploitation of user labor becomes part of this trafficking experience, a sort of labor bargain that users are engaging in and participating in, and they don't necessarily fully understand or appreciate, and that is pretty fundamentally exploitative. And this occurs on platforms like TikTok, like Twitter, WeChat, etc. Then finally, there's this idea of data traffic. So when we're thinking about platforms as a type of way to generate money and to generate engagement. Maybe the East West Center is trying to generate engagement on its YouTube page as we speak. So this is a way in which we can see monetization of user data, and by the flow of additional users and of additional people onto platforms. So when we think about data trafficking, we can think about a lot of different layers of this idea of traffic, of intimacy, of the labor bargain, of this idea of addiction, of this idea of the movement of data and of user engagement. Now this is all part of the larger US tech ecosystem, and it's kind of at the core of the US tech ecosystem. So because of unprecedented growth in the tech sector, which incidentally has really driven American national power in the financial sector and globally in the tech sector for decades, we see a very fragmented regulatory landscape. And this is underscored by that image many of you may have seen of Mark Zuckerberg speaking in front of Congress and asking questions, or the members of Congress asking questions that look like, Mark Zuckerberg was explaining computers to his dad, and this creates a really tricky dynamic for regulation. Now this is all based on this idea of surveillance capitalism that Shoshana Zuboff described in 2019, the exploitation of the human experience for the growth of these platforms through extraction on social platforms. And this is really grounded also in this idea of network effects, or the ways in which the more users there are on the platform, the more we see these platforms are successful. So, some of you may not be on Facebook anymore because nobody's on Facebook, quote unquote. And this is an example of network effects failing. Or my students are in the opposite situation, where I taught a full class called The Data Ethics of TikTok, where they carefully read the TikTok terms of service and were like, Professor, I don't really want to be on this platform anymore, but I also want to have friends. So I'm not sure what to do. So it's a tricky dynamic, and that's kind of where network effects help to inform data trafficking. Now all of this occurs within a backdrop of an atmosphere of really increasing tension in the US-China relationship that has also led to a complicated environment for Asian Americans in the United States, an increase in anti-Asian violence. So when I talk about all these issues, particularly in a US context, I want to be clear that this is a concern of the US regulatory landscape, and it's also a concern with how China is interacting in the rest of the world from a digital standpoint, but that it needs to be discussed in a very narrow and targeted way. That these are policy decisions that digital policies are being made in Beijing that are designed to have a very expansive extraterritorial effect, but that the only reason that these are able to be effective in a US context to gather and extract data in the US, or to at least have, or to even have that threat or possibility, is because of the fragmented US regulatory environment. That being said, the Chinese government has really created a very expansive vision for what constitutes digital or cyber sovereignty. So for example, through the 2021 data security law, there's the principle of national security data audits, which enable the Chinese government, and specifically the Cyberspace Administration of China, to review all data being gathered by Chinese firms and firms operating in China. So this would include Apple's Chinese operations and WeChat's operations in the US, for example. This also is bolstered by things like the Hong Kong National Security Law, which allows for national security violations to be committed anywhere in the world, including on digital platforms. So, for example, our discussion right now, if I was to be critical of the Chinese government in this room here in Washington, in our online environment, could be considered to be critical of the Hong Kong National Security Law and a potential national security violation. So there are really substantial extraterritorial scope of Chinese government regulations. And I'm happy to talk about those ad nauseum in great depth during the Q&A for anyone who's interested, but I won't give you the alphabet soup right now. But what this comes down to is the importance of good governance and of combining a relatively fragmented regulatory environment. So I had the chance to speak on CNN on Sunday about the South Dakota law banning TikTok from government devices. And I think this is a classic example of where governance needs to shift, because banning a platform in one state's government devices and in its interactions underscores the fragmented nature of this data governance landscape. So it doesn't include the sex toys that my auntie was interested in. It doesn't include baby monitors. It doesn't include things like WeChat. It also creates an environment where we have different data governance regimes in different states. And this is adding on to things like the fact that children under 13 have different supports and regulations for their data, that there are different rules for data from doctors' offices than there would be from Fitbits. So for example, your health data is protected if you're talking to your doctor about it, but it's not protected if you're gathering it on your Apple Watch. And these are things that most people don't understand. Most people shouldn't have to understand. And so I argue that there's a really significant importance of developing a kind of more widespread regulatory framework. Now I've talked with my friend DL, and who spent time in government, and I know that he will very rightly highlight the challenge of all of these things. And one of the privileges of being an academic is being able to raise problems and raise concerns without having to specifically implement the solutions. So I am aware of that privilege, and I'm really excited about the chance to be in dialogue with Professor Sahashi and Dwar McNeil about these challenges and how they might be addressed on a global and national level. So ultimately, we see that in this U.S.-China context, there's a regulatory asymmetry between China and the United States that has led to difficulty as it relates to this type of governance. And the U.S. tech sector, though it has historically been an engine for U.S. growth, also has a lot of interest in maintaining its presence in China. So, for example, Tesla, a networked mobility company as much as a car company, is only making money in China right now. So this becomes a really substantial question as to which regulatory regime becomes more important, the country where you're making money or the one where you're not. And we can think about Elon Musk's approach to capitalism to kind of get a pretty good answer to that question. But ultimately, the illiberal threads that we see in the U.S. tech sector, this idea of extractive data with very limited oversight of the type of data that users from any platform, not just a Chinese platform or a platform based in South Korea are gathering, but any platforms that are operating in the U.S. Is fundamentally amplified by the fact that the Chinese government has outlined a framework to extract a wide range of user data. And ultimately, I argue this contentious relationship is destabilizing for the entire world, because when it comes down to it, most countries are choosing between U.S. tech platforms and Chinese tech platforms in some sort of their decision making. And this is really a huge challenge. When I've given this talk in different contexts, very fairly, people from a wide range of other countries, and I wonder if Sahashi Sensei will bring this up, will highlight the fact that it's not easy to choose between China and the U.S. because neither of them feel like very reliable actors in this context. Silicon Valley firms are highly extractive. The Chinese government has noted how it will leverage and use user data. So this is choosing not between two obvious choices. So I'm really interested to hear and to talk more about that in our Q&A and in our panel. So I'd like to thank all of you again for your time and attention. This is a very dense subject matter, and I really appreciate you sitting here on this rainy day to talk about it. But if you're interested in more specific case studies about social media or gaming or health or consumer products, our Trafficking Data is available anywhere books are sold. And you can also find op-eds, excerpts, podcasts, etc. On my page at the Miller Center if you just want a little additional taste. So thank you so much for your time and attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Anne, for laying out that very, very interesting case. We're going to go to Rio and then Dordrecht, but let me just lay two questions on the table just to frame for a person who does not know the subject and has not, thank you for the book, but has not yet read the book. To what level is this monetization issue now becoming, how is it turning, how is the financial markets dealing with the monetization issue? Are they, people used to bundle mortgages. Are we bundling the monetization packages, and are they having discernible impacts on financial markets for which sector you should be in because of the data inherent in them? So that's one question. And the second one is, again, as a non-expert, is there anything analogous we've had before? So we're talking about data, but presumably we had fragmented US legal structures and policy structures for previous breathtaking innovations, the phone, electronics in cars, and silly examples. But my point being, is this problem set fundamentally more wicked and different than others, and that the fragmented regulatory and policy plan will catch up? Or is the problem set just so different, we've never seen anything like it, and we'll never be able to get a coherent thing, which leads to the moral hazards and security hazards that you've identified? And just put that on the table and go over to Rio.
Yeah, those are great questions.
Rio, over to you, sir.
Yep. So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this very important roundtable, and I'm really glad to come here because Anne is my great friend. But also, I really wanted to congratulate her for this very excellent books. As you know, she published her first book, Hollywood Made in China. That was excellent book, but I think that book was published just 5 or 6 years ago, right? But within 5 or 6 years, she completed the next book. So this is very amazing. So I really wanted to congratulate her here. And I really love this book. And one of the reasons is academically, this is very well organized. Starting from the good legal definition of data trafficking and data sovereignty, and she also analyzed, American response, American policy and Chinese policy, and how China tried to come into United States. And after that, she spent 5 case studies, starting from social media, gaming, money, health, and home. So, and she concluded with a long list of proposals to the American government. So this is DRX Books with this great organization. So I really love your book as academia. So, and you contrasted American approach and Chinese approach really in a good way. American approach is less fair approach to data. Private firms can do everything. And Chinese approach is, oh yes, it is very Chinese, right? Communist approach, to nationalize the data and also encourage Chinese state and also private companies at their own control. But I think reading your books, my impression is you suggest American government towards the direction European Union and Japanese government is now taking. And that is the third way, actually. EU and Japan, I can elaborate Japanese position now, but my biggest comments to you today is EU and Japanese way are really desirable and also competitive, right? This is a point. American approach, even though, as you say, it is a little bit illegal in consumer data protection, but very competitive in some aspects. And Japanese and EU approach might not be so competitive enough, to compete with China and Chinese firms. In the data protection world, it is said we have trilemma, as you know, data protection and consumer protection and the power to compete. And I think, looking over Japanese case, our case is not so competitive against other countries. We are really good in protecting consumers' data. last few years, we changed law twice. I mean, the law to protect consumers' data. And the government, the former government, even published comprehensive data strategy. That is not available in English, but it's in Japanese. So, but their approach is not only to protect data, but try to encourage all stakeholders to use Japanese data from private firms and from the public domains. But it is say Japanese approach too strong protection still, and companies and any other academia still having a big difficulty in making use of the data. So my point is, if you suggest United States and other global North countries go to the EU and Japanese way, could we really compete with China and their model? So this is the biggest point I wanted to make today. And which model really compete and really stronger in coming decades? And just three minor points. The first one is you mentioned about the finance and WeChat money and the currency, digital currency. Now in China, still the currency, digital currency is under the control of the private firms, but now the discussion is about digital renminbi, RMB. So will it change the landscape? I mean, the data will be controlled more by the central bank and the central government in China. But having said that, that could be the problem for Chinese or any foreigners residing in China. So could we really worry, as a persons, as residents residing in foreign countries, right? Of course, TikTok is troublesome. And we also use some other Chinese service. But do Chinese firms and companies have another good service which attracts, other like European, American, and Japanese people? I really don't think so. Of course, TikTok again is a really big service. But as a people, I mean, like myself, living now in the United States, but also living in Japan, I don't use Chinese app so much. So, at where, by how, we have to worry about our data, and So, yeah, data trafficking is really worrisome, but TikTok is worrisome, Huawei is worrisome, but any other, good candidates which we have to keep big worry. And my final point, I'm now running out of my time, but my final point is you suggest a data stabilization as an approach, alternative approach to data in your final concluding chapter, and that is really good chapter. I really recommend all policymakers in Washington should read that chapter. And Japanese government is now promoting the idea of trust, and including DFT, digital free flow with trust. Data flow with trust. That is our approach. So what is the difference? And what we have to do for international cooperation or international governance? And my worry is, like EU, Japan, and maybe United States is also catching up with us in data protection. But could we really proliferate our approach to global South? That is a kind of headway for us now, right? Many countries and many people still don't care so much about their data, right? And coming back to my original first question, if we push so much to stronger regulation to data, consumer data protection, that might not be competitive, and that also might not be attractive for many people in the world. So what is the best approach? So data stabilization might be really important for Japan, EU, and United States, of course. But could we really push this idea to the world outside? So thank you very much for the time and for this invitation.
Rio, thanks so much and for raising such a fundamental, interesting issue. I'm particularly interested in this desirability, competitiveness issue. Because as you say, much of the world doesn't care about data. And could we see a fragmentation in regimes, if you will, for the lack of a better word, where US, Japan, EU are more aligned, and then China and the rest of the world have a different sort of system, which creates a set of issues that maybe we can go to. But we have next wonderfully with us, Dewardrick McNeil. Dewardrick, welcome and thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Satu, and thank you to the East West Center of Washington for hosting us this morning. Let me first congratulate my friend on a great book. You can see it's fairly well marked up, but I learned an awful lot about data and the challenges with respect to Washington and data by reading this book. I have a lot of thoughts. Let me try to at least center them around my concerns long term, and then I'll get into some of the short term issues. Look, I think to Satu's point, the story of data is still being written, and I'm extremely concerned that Washington is already behind what is something that has really got out in front of us. China, for those listening, has defined data as a factor of production. They have elevated it to the same level as labor, as land, and capital. So that ought to tell you something about how they're thinking about data. They've also set up, Satu, to your point, several data exchanges where you can now exchange data as a commodity. Shenzhen just opened their
You mean on the market?
on the market.
I'll be darned.
Absolutely.
I didn't know
Very opaque. We have no idea how that's being done, but the fact that it is being done is something that we should all take note of. Here in Washington, or at least in the U.S., we face twin challenges of a permissive corporate environment and consumers who are either uneducated or unconcerned. And both of those things make it very hard to move a policy in this town. When you have a permissive corporate environment where corporations want things to continue the way that they are, and consumers who don't really know everything that I learned by reading this great book, and it's scary. So there's a real rock that we're going to have to push uphill. I'm looking at my friend, Dr. Kokas, who's going to help us do this. But, you know, one of my real concerns here is that the book talks a lot about this, but I think where you really start to move the dial in Washington, particularly with respect to China, I know I'm going to get hit for always securitizing the relationship, but the national security angle here, you know, we've gotten very little traction on the consumer side, unfortunately, because there's a lot that we should do to protect consumers. But when you start looking at the national security angle here, I think you really begin to see how you can move the dial on some of this in Washington. Again, I'm very aware that with everything China is not always security. I'm aware of that. In this case, though, I think it's legitimate to look at data and trafficking of data through a security, although not exclusive security, lens. Let me just, before I get too deep in this, look at some of the areas that I think we should consider with respect to policy, or at least the policy environment here. And in the book, page 196 actually, Dr. Kokas talks about financial reporting requirements. I really like this as a potential here to address the permissive corporate environment. She notes that the Securities and Exchange Commission could examine ways to shift the quarter and annual reporting requirements to get more companies to focus on or detail and describe how data is collected, stored, analyzed. I think that really has some resonance with me, particularly when you look at what happened with the Holding Foreign Countries Accountable. Once that was released, it sent a strong signal to Chinese companies in particular that you cannot access the market without having some degree of transparency and accountability. So I think we should really take a look at that. Again, we'll see what happens with holding foreign countries accountable, but at least it sent a signal that we were serious about this issue. So I would suggest that we take a look at that as a potential here. On the legislative side, the news is not good, unfortunately. And that's not because there's a Republican House coming in. But, you know, in the book, also you referenced the American Data Privacy and Protection draft legislation that was introduced in June of this year, which stalled immediately. And it stalled largely because, again, it was consumer focused, and immediately you saw every single person with an equity on this issue lobby to keep it exactly the way that it is. But I think we should look at legislation. Perhaps this is not the vehicle. Perhaps something like the National Defense Authorization Act or other vehicles where we really start to talk about data is important. And then quickly here, the whole of government approach, you know, I'm really fond of what I consider to be one of the least known but frequently used vehicles, and that's the executive legislative commissions. So a commission that includes both houses of Congress, both parties, bipartisan, and then the various agencies on the executive branch side. This past year, I had the privilege of serving on the Commission for Combating the Trafficking of Synthetic Opioids. There's a China angle to this with precursors. And what this allowed for us to do was really surface the equities, who's doing what, who has responsibility for what, bring in the private sector, bring in people like me, to really discuss this issue of opioid trafficking. I think we should consider something like that with respect to data. And then as a nod to our allies and people who are farther along than us, including Japan, look, I think the TTC, which is meeting currently, as I understand, Technology and Trade Council, is a good way. There should have been a data working group. It hasn't really gone as far as perhaps Anne and I and others would like it, but I think we should really look at that as a multilateral way to start to learn. I say learn. I know this is anathema in Washington, but perhaps those who are farther along than us can teach us something about this. So whether it's GDPR or what the Japanese are doing, or something in between, I think there's a lot to learn on this issue. I will stop there. I just want to flag one thing before I do, because it's another issue of the story of data not being written. I'm extremely concerned after reading this book that with the Investment and Infrastructure Jobs Act, the IIJA, where we have put billions of dollars in place to put in place 500,000 EV chargers. You know, the data footprint that you're going to generate when people start to plug into that system, if that data is not protected, we don't understand how that data is being used. It has serious implications for national security, but also competitiveness. If EVs are the vehicle of the future, and that data is not protected and finds its way somehow into China for nefarious means, then there's a real concern there. There are requirements for people who are applying for those funds to tell the government how they are protecting data with respect to cyber attacks, but as the book reveals, there's more than one way to really traffic data. It's not just about an incursion. A lot of the stuff is being traded by companies as well. And so, you know, there's a lot of things to still learn about this. The story is not yet fully written, as I said, but I encourage everyone to read it. I learned a lot, and there's a lot to be concerned about, to be honest with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, George, and especially for those very interesting policy suggestions. It'd be really neat to see what kinds of stuff. What really struck me about Anne's comments and yours was fragmentation of policy and regulations in the U.S. political structure does not occur in a vacuum. They're directly related to interests, let's call them, competitive marketplace and what have you. And it is difficult from the outside to see, as we move to an even more data-intensive society, EVs just being one tip of the iceberg. How is it possible to even conceive of these? Your term is very interesting. Now I want to go home and read the terms of use on all my gadgets.
Or
to
maybe
see-
you don't.
Or maybe I don't, because I'll just flee to the mountains or something and hide out in the cabin, and people will send me smoke signals. But you know, I was thinking, you know, those didn't appear there by accident. Those are you know, surgically scalpel-like language developed by folks who have a very deep profit and governance interest in what those terms of use are. So how you get at that in two drivers where there's more data, and increasingly our society is built on use of data, remains to be seen. But you're going to sort it out in your next book in the next few minutes. So let me open it up to the floor to take any more questions, and otherwise people on YouTube, you're going to transmit questions to me, if there's someone from YouTube. But right now let me just ask anyone from the floor, and then I also want to have some give and take between the discussion here on the panel. Anyone? Yeah, Elena, please, and then we'll take the two hands there. Please introduce yourself. We have a mic right up top so the folks on YouTube can.
I'm going to stand or am I sitting?
As you're comfortable, but just raise your voice a little so folks can maybe hear your question. I'll repeat it for YouTube viewers.
Okay, so Elena Noor from the Asian Society Policy Institute. Thank you for this wonderful book, which I haven't read, but I'm looking forward to reading. And so my questions may seem a little out of turn, but I think it's really interesting that you've chosen to use the term data trafficking because this is not an original thought. People have said that apart from drugs, the only other industry that uses the term users is related to the digital sphere, right? And so that actually gets to my two questions. The first is I heard during the discussion mention of, I think it was three things, right? Data protection, consumer protection, and competition. And I don't know how you framed it in your book, but I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how those objectives differ or come together. Because from my view, there is a symbiosis between or amongst all three of them. And you see that in China, you see that in the US as well. We've seen that actually, you know, prior to all this stuff about data. At least on the digital sphere, you had it with phones, like, you know, Verizon feeding information to the US government, which eventually led to the global war on terror, et cetera, et cetera. And then second question relates to the point that Rio brought up about the global south. Going back to this idea about users, I think we have to remember that the world's largest markets for all these tech platforms is actually, quote unquote, the global south, which is the global majority. And so a lot of regulation that's being framed in, you know, the hallways of Congress, US Congress, or not, as the case may be, right? Or in Brussels, or even in Tokyo, actually govern the lives of most of the world's people. And a lot of these companies are making money off of the backs and lives of people in the majority of the world. And so that extraction is actually a lot deeper than what we might imagine it to be. How do you see good governance along those lines beyond just what's going on between the US and China?
Start with that question and take a run now. First with Anne and anyone else who wants to comment, and we'll move to the other two questions.
Great, thank you for that superb question. And so this actually, Satu mentioned my next book, but this actually speaks to the next project that I'm looking at. And looking at how countries deal with the competition between the U.S. and China. One of the examples that I find to be particularly fascinating is the case of India, which has its own very large domestic market. It also produces a wide range of different tech products, maybe not global platforms that people use, but a wide array of different types of tech infrastructure. And in India, we do see the evolution of a very sophisticated domestic digital governance framework, and actually a digital citizenship idea under this concept of Aadhaar. So people having their own kind of digital footprint that is traced through the course of their lifespan, as well as efforts to focus on data localization, so the storage of data domestically. Now, the advantage that India has that a lot of other countries don't have is a large domestic market paired with a powerful tech sector that is very interested in a lot of these issues. So I think that we are seeing, and I think that there will probably be more fragmentation before there's more coalescence in terms of data governance. But one of the reasons why I think it's important for the U.S., even in this context of a challenging environment for competition that Rio rightly pointed out, why it's important for there to be more consensus or a movement toward discussion and learning and consensus and learning as Duarte pointed out is the need to develop some kind of consensus within developed democracies or allies so that there are actual potential choices between China's model and other models. Because at this point, it's really unclear how countries may move forward. Because there's not really a Western democratic model that's being put forth. Because there is competition between how Japan approaches things, how the EU approaches things, how Australia, how India, how the US deal with these questions. And there's also kind of internecine feuding between the EU and the United States on these issues as well. So I think I do support more of a more data governance and oversight than currently exists in the US. And I think that there is definitely a movement forward that can be made through a lot of the policy proposals, for example, that DL brought up, that would at least help to bring forth a little bit more consensus than we currently see, without totally destroying the competitive environment. But I want to be sure to have Rio and DL answer these questions as well. As I think
Yeah,
it's
please,
important.
please, let's have your input.
I think it's a great question. My real concern about the Global South is precisely this lack of ability to help shape the standards that they are being governed by. And I don't know how you solve that problem, but I do think it's important for us to continue to raise the issue that it's more than just the big two here, and often it's the middle that is being taken advantage of. With respect to China and data, and this is not to get away from what U.S. corporations are doing to extract data from these places, but what I'm really growing concerned about is smart cities designs
Yeah.
and the use of the data center in these places that the Chinese are granting to many of these places. It's a data suck in many ways, and even if the center is co-located there, where the data is extracted and processed is a different issue, and a lot of that goes back into China for its nefarious uses or corporate uses. It all depends. So I don't know how you bring the Global South into this discussion. What comes to mind though is a framework like the COP situation where we've seen climate, the Global South really take a lead in pushing the U.S., China, and others forward on being more involved in their climate thinking. I would love to see some, and I leave this to Anne to figure out, but some idea about how you competize data. I'm making up the word. That's the only thing I can see in the near term.
I'm gonna take that, by the way. You're yielding it. I'll take it and run with it.
Noted for the next book.
Noted.
I think Anne will like everything, so you don't need my comments. But I think, as DA also say, I think their big task is, I think global South countries are still lacks in norm-setting capability, but also they really need help for their infrastructure from outside, even including smart city. So I think, but consensus building is a really key word, especially for global North countries. And we have a huge discussion in each country what is the best balance in the trilemma, as I said. But I still don't know the good answer for the global South countries, right? Because they still need infrastructure first, right? And so this is a priority issue. So I still don't have a good solution for that. What we can do is, to I guess not educate, but to give more clear information about the risk of data trafficking, and also advise them to read another book from Aynne Kokas.
Thank you.
We'll go to that. We're running a little bit over, so I'm going to take the next two questions together, please, and then we'll just have one final response from our panel, only because I'm conscious of time and we're also live streaming. So, yes, please. Please introduce yourself and state your comment or question.
Thank you very much for the presentation. My name is Rio Tanaka. I'm from American University. My question is about international framework for cooperation. Is there any possibilities that existing international framework in the West can develop to a community where policymakers from these countries can have consensus in terms of data governance? Or should we start, I mean, right now the phase is that because I see the EU, Japan has started negotiations on rules on cross-border data flows. The phase is not that developed yet, but I'm curious how existing international framework can contribute to this data governance.
Thank you, Tanaka-san. Stanley, did you have anything? Okay.
So we're over time.
All right. Yes, in our visiting fellow from Bangladesh, who's currently here as an Asia Studies visiting fellow working on the Rohingya issue, Dr. Nasir Uddin. Nasir, please.
Thank you so much. It's very interesting to follow this wonderful topic and wonderful presentation too. So I have very specific questions. One is, I was wondering how you have, or whether you have traffic data to write this book. I mean, what's the methodology of using data? So that's one question. The second one is, actually you talked about the kind of firms who use this kind of data in China and US. So I'm interested to know how this kind of data trafficking between two largest economies could create a kind of potential challenges and threats to non-Western countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Both for your questions, please, to the panel.
Would you like to take the first question?
Oh, about international.
How about international frameworks that might lead to?
I think the discussion is still going on and cannot reach at a good conclusion, right? Yeah. So I still don't have a good answer for that, for the global governance things. And what I can say is, this is economic negotiation. Trade is not my center of my research, but is TPP is still a really good framework for that. So it is very difficult to say that in Washington now. Right? Come back to
It's said all the time. It's difficult to move that direction, right?
That's the issue.
Yeah, but TTC, is a really good framework between United States and the EU, and we have, IPEF is not the framework for this data protection, but I think we have to figure out the good framework, at least amongst the EU, United States, and Japan. But
Rio, would it be wrong to say that the data, cross-border data flows discussion, either in the Transatlantic Alliance or amongst the G7, trails discussion of supply chain resilience, semiconductors, and those kind of hot issues now that are kind of on the front burner? Is that fair?
Yeah.
That cross-border data flows are not as seen as the top level issues?
I think, of course, we try to promote the idea of DFFT, as I say.
Yes.
But still, somehow last few years, supply chain and semiconductor are really top. And recently, I just read a really good column from my good friend, Keio University professor Motohiro Tsuchiya. And he recently wrote, even Japanese approach to economic security does not have a big priority, doesn't put a big priority on data and
On
data
data.
protection.
I see.
So I think we really have to, pay more attention to data.
I see. George, do you have any comments on those, on the questions of Nasir and Tanaka?
You know, I don't really have a good answer. I think, again, as I said, some of the things that we see with respect to TTC and some of the other frameworks, I think, are useful. What I don't know, and what I would be interested in, I was going to actually raise this with Anne, is what are WTO rules with respect to data and data trafficking? I don't know the answer to that. And it's so difficult these days to really get that body to do anything as well. So it's as stuck as Washington, really. But I do think that we have to figure out how we deal with more of a global look at trafficking data. I do want to just state that we reference the permissive environment for corporations. They've actually gotten a pass in this panel, and I want to go back to them because with respect to U.S. corporations, I think some pressure from shareholders and consumers would prevent Washington from needing to move if companies themselves were more responsible about data. And so I don't want them to skate in this panel. There are things that we can do here in Washington, but there are also things that I think we have to push companies benefiting from our data to do.
And that's just to wrap things up.
Yeah.
I think that one of the reasons why I wrote the book, and one of the reasons why I'm so excited to talk with people with the East West Center community and with people more broadly about these issues, is that I think while these issues can only be, full data stabilization can only be achieved with policy solutions from a wide range of government consensuses in democratic countries. One of the ways in which those policy priorities become elevated is through agitation and discussion from consumers. But if consumers do not understand what's happening with their user data and are lulled into this idea, my friend Nora Draper and Joseph Trudeau came up with this great term called digital resignation. So if we're digitally resigned and users don't actually take these concerns seriously, then it becomes even more difficult to move forward with any of these policy considerations. So thank you so much. I want to thank the panel, and I want to thank our wonderful moderator, and I want to thank the East West Center for being supportive of my work for the past more than 20 years. So.
Well, as you could see, I promised you a stellar panel, and indeed we had a stellar panel with Dr. Kokas and Sahashi Sensei and Georgia McNeil. So we're really delighted, and the fact that two of them are alumni of the East West Center programs makes it even sort of sweeter to have them back and so prominent in their respective communities and the work that they do. So thank you, and always happy to see friends. Just to make two marketing announcements, we have Dr. Nasir Uddin on the 13th morning at 10 a.m. will be speaking on the Rohingya issue, and he approaches this issue from the issue of legality, democracy, human rights, and so we'll be looking at how that issue is playing out. So please, notify your friends or your colleagues or pass along to sign up for our events and publications list. And another colleague of ours from the Philippines, a very active journalist there, Renee Acosta, will speak the following week on the U.S.-Philippine alliance, which has gone through significant changes over the last 2-3 years. But in any case, thank you for taking time both online and in person to join us here at the East West Center in Washington. And please do consider joining our lists for publications, events, etc. Thank you all, and a special thank to Dr. Aynne Kokas and our discussants.